September 23, 1944. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler sat in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft on a grass airfield near Munich, engine silent, waiting for fuel that would never come. Around him, 43 other Luftwaffe fighters sat in perfect rows, each one fully armed, mechanically sound, and completely useless. The fuel trucks that were supposed to arrive that morning had been destroyed by American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers attacking the rail yards 30 kilometers away. The irony wasn't lost on Stiegler. The Americans had so much fuel they could afford to use their fighters as flying artillery, strafing ground targets with thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and still have enough fuel to fly home to England. Meanwhile, Germany had hundreds of world-class fighter aircraft sitting on airfields across the Reich, grounded not by battle damage or mechanical failure, but by simple mathematics. Each P-47 Thunderbolt cost the United States $85,000 to build. Republic Aviation and its subcontractors had produced 15,673 of them by war's end. But the real strategic weapon wasn't the aircraft itself. It was the fuel infrastructure that kept them flying. America produced 6 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, even at peak production, could barely produce enough aviation gasoline to keep a fraction of the Luftwaffe operational. This is the story of how Germany lost air superiority not because they couldn't build fighters, but because they couldn't fuel them. How the most technically advanced air force in the world was destroyed not by enemy guns, but by empty fuel tanks. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be a great fighter aircraft. When it first entered service in 1942, pilots called it the 7-ton milk jug. It was enormous for a single-engine fighter. Empty weight was 4.5 tons. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot, it weighed over 8 tons. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower and consumed fuel at a staggering rate. At maximum power, the P-47 burned through its internal fuel supply in just 45 minutes. Early models had a combat radius of only 175 miles, making them nearly useless for bomber escort missions deep into Germany. American pilots who had flown the nimble P-51 Mustang or the quick-turning Spitfire considered the Thunderbolt a flying brick. But Republic Aviation's engineers had designed something that turned out to be far more valuable than a dogfighter. They had designed a survivable weapons platform. The P-47's massive radial engine could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep running. Its rugged construction meant it could dive faster than any German fighter and pull out of that dive without the wings tearing off. And most importantly, it could carry an enormous external load. By 1944, P-47s were routinely operating with 2 75-gallon drop tanks and either bombs or rockets under the wings. This transformed them from short-range interceptors into long-range fighter bombers that could escort bombers to the target, drop their external tanks, fight their way through German fighters, strafe ground targets on the way home, and still land with fuel in reserve. The mathematics of P-47 production reveal the first half of this story. Republic Aviation's main factory in Farmingdale, New York, employed 43,000 workers by 1944. The assembly line ran 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. At peak production in 1944, Republic was completing 14 P-47s every single day, 14 complete fighter aircraft rolling off the production line daily. But that was just Republic's factory. Curtiss-Wright produced P-47s under license at their Buffalo plant, another 330 per month. The total P-47 production in 1944 alone was 5,822 aircraft. That's more than the entire Luftwaffe fighter force strength at the beginning of 1944. America wasn't just producing fighters. America was producing fighters faster than Germany could destroy them. And every single one of those fighters needed fuel. lots of fuel. A P-47 on a typical mission over Germany would burn through 400 gallons of aviation gasoline. 400 gallons for one sortie by one aircraft. Multiply that by the hundreds of P-47s flying every day, and you start to understand the scale of the fuel logistics required. But America could do it because America had oil. In 1944, American oil production reached 6 billion barrels annually. 6 billion barrels. Of that, roughly 300 million barrels were refined into aviation gasoline. This high-octane fuel required complex refining processes. You couldn't just pump crude oil out of the ground and pour it into an aircraft. The gasoline had to be refined to precise specifications. 100 octane or higher to prevent engine knock in high-compression aircraft engines. This required catalytic cracking units, alkylation plants, and other sophisticated refinery equipment. America had it all. The Sun Oil Company's Marcus Hook Refinery in Pennsylvania, the Standard Oil Refinery in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the Shell Oil facilities in California, dozens of refineries across the country, all producing aviation gasoline at a rate that would have seemed impossible to German planners. The United States produced more aviation gasoline in 1 month than Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry produced in a year. And this fuel didn't just power American aircraft. Under the Lend-Lease program, America was also supplying aviation gasoline to Britain and the Soviet Union. American tankers crossed the Atlantic carrying millions of gallons of fuel. American pipelines moved fuel from refineries to ports. American logistics units built fuel storage facilities across England to support the bomber offensive. The entire system was designed around abundance. If a P-47 came back from a mission with fuel remaining, nobody cared. Fuel was cheap and plentiful. The pilot could taxi around the airfield, burn off excess fuel, and still have plenty for the next mission. Germany's fuel situation was the exact opposite. Germany had virtually no natural oil reserves. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești provided some crude oil, but nowhere near enough for Germany's military needs. Hitler had understood this vulnerability from the beginning, which is why Germany had invested heavily in synthetic fuel production. The Bergius process could convert coal into synthetic gasoline. Germany had plenty of coal. The IG Farben chemical conglomerate built massive synthetic fuel plants across Germany. By 1943, these plants were producing about 5.7 million tons of synthetic fuel annually. This sounds impressive until you run the numbers. 5.7 million tons equals roughly 42 million barrels. Remember, America produced 6 billion barrels of natural oil. Germany's entire synthetic fuel production was less than 1% of American natural oil production, and German synthetic fuel was vastly more expensive. Each gallon of synthetic aviation gasoline cost approximately $2 to produce in 1943, compared to about 15 cents per gallon for American naturally refined gasoline. Germany was paying 13 times more per gallon and producing less than 1% of the volume. The strategic mathematics were catastrophic, but the story gets worse for Germany. Those synthetic fuel plants required enormous amounts of electricity, water, and industrial capacity. Each plant was a huge fixed installation that couldn't be hidden or moved. And starting in May 1944, those plants became priority targets for Allied strategic bombing. The oil campaign, as it became known, was devastatingly effective. On May 12, 1944, American B-17s and B-24s bombed the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Brooks, and other locations. Damage was severe. Production dropped immediately. By June, German aviation fuel production had fallen to 52% of the May levels. By September, it was down to 35%. And it kept falling. Luftwaffe units received increasingly desperate fuel allocation orders. In early 1944, a fighter group of 40 aircraft might receive enough fuel for 400 sorties per month. By September 1944, the same group received fuel for maybe 200 sorties. By December, perhaps 100 sorties. And by March 1945, some Gruppen received no aviation fuel allocation at all. They were told to preserve their aircraft for a final defensive battle that never came because there was no fuel to fly it. The impact on Luftwaffe operations was immediate and catastrophic. Skilled German pilots sat on the ground watching American bombers fly overhead, unable to intercept because their aircraft had no fuel. On September 17, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation of the war. Over 2,000 Allied transport aircraft and gliders flew to the Netherlands, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The entire armada flew in daylight across German-occupied territory. Luftwaffe fighters in the region had fuel for approximately 60 sorties total. They managed a few weak intercepts and shot down a handful of transports, but the vast majority of the operation proceeded unopposed. Not because the Luftwaffe lacked aircraft or pilots, but because they lacked fuel. German fighter units would receive intelligence about incoming American bomber formations. They would calculate that they had enough fighters to inflict serious casualties on the bombers. They would brief the pilots, plan the intercept, and then discover that fuel allocations were insufficient for the entire Gruppe to take off. Sometimes only a staffel of 12 aircraft could fly, sometimes only 4 aircraft. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. They knew they were being defeated not by American fighter pilots, but by American fuel tankers. The training crisis made everything worse. New Luftwaffe pilots in 1944 received perhaps 30 to 50 hours of flight training before being sent to combat units. This was barely enough to learn basic flying skills, let alone combat tactics. American and British pilots received 200 to 300 hours of training. The disparity existed because Germany didn't have fuel for training flights. Every gallon of aviation gasoline consumed in training was one less gallon available for combat operations. So Germany made the calculated decision to minimize training and send inexperienced pilots into combat. These pilots lasted an average of 7 combat missions before being killed or shot down. The Luftwaffe was destroying its own future because it couldn't afford to properly train replacements. Meanwhile, American pilots trained extensively in the United States, flew to England with hundreds of hours already logged, and then flew dozens of practice missions over England before entering combat. They arrived at their operational squadrons as skilled, confident pilots. And every single training flight, every practice mission, every hour in the air was fueled by that endless supply of American oil. The cost comparison reveals the ultimate strategic irony. A P-47 Thunderbolt cost $85,000 to build. The fuel required to keep that P-47 operational for 1 year cost approximately $12,000. So the annual operating cost was only 14% of the aircraft's purchase price. For American planners, this was trivial. Build the plane for $85,000, operate it for $12,000 per year, and if it gets shot down, build another one. The manufacturing capacity existed, the fuel existed, the pilot training pipeline existed. Every element of the system was designed around abundance. For Germany, a Focke-Wulf 190 cost approximately $65,000 equivalent to build. But the fuel cost to operate it for 1 year using expensive synthetic fuel was approximately $38,000, more than half the aircraft's purchase price. And Germany couldn't produce enough synthetic fuel to operate even a fraction of its aircraft inventory. By late 1944, Germany had approximately 1,500 operational single-engine fighters. If they had wanted to fly all of them on a single maximum effort mission, they would have needed about 600,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. Germany's remaining synthetic fuel plants could produce about 60,000 gallons of aviation gasoline per day. So flying one maximum effort mission consumed 10 days' worth of Germany's total daily fuel production. The mathematics made sustained operations impossible. The final act of this fuel catastrophe came during Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. The Luftwaffe scraped together enough fuel for one massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Over 900 German fighters took off at dawn, flying at low level to avoid radar detection. They achieved complete surprise, destroying or damaging over 400 Allied aircraft on the ground. It was the Luftwaffe's last great victory, and it was also the Luftwaffe's death blow. Because while German fighters destroyed Allied aircraft, Allied anti-aircraft gunners shot down over 200 Luftwaffe fighters. More critically, the Luftwaffe lost 143 pilots killed or captured, including 27 experienced Gruppe and Staffel commanders. These men were irreplaceable. And the fuel consumed by 900 fighters flying a 2-hour mission was fuel that Germany's reserves couldn't absorb. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe never again mounted a major offensive operation. Not because they lacked aircraft, but because they had burned their entire fuel reserve on one desperate gamble. The P-47 Thunderbolts and other Allied fighters that were destroyed on the ground were replaced within days. The American aircraft factories were still running. The fuel refineries were still producing. The training schools were still graduating new pilots. The system was designed to sustain losses and continue operating. By March 1945, the final month of significant air combat over Germany, the fuel situation had become absurd. Luftwaffe units would occasionally receive 55-gallon drums of aviation gasoline, enough for perhaps 2 or 3 fighters to fly one short mission. Priority was given to defending synthetic fuel plants, which meant fighters needed fuel to defend the facilities that produced fuel. It was a circular strategic death spiral. Allied fighters roamed over Germany with near impunity. P-47s flew ground attack missions with minimal opposition. They destroyed locomotives, strafed vehicles, bombed bridges, all while German fighters sat on their airfields with empty tanks. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to conserve fuel by towing fighters to the end of the runway with horses or tractors, starting the engines only for takeoff. Others tried mixing lower-grade fuel with aviation gasoline to stretch supplies. Some pilots died when these fuel mixtures caused engine failures during combat. The desperation was complete. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied forces captured thousands of German aircraft sitting on airfields. Many were brand new, still in factory primer paint, never flown because no fuel existed. The Luftwaffe hadn't been defeated in air combat. It had been starved to death by its own fuel poverty while watching its enemy fly overhead powered by an ocean of oil. The P-47 cost $85,000. The fuel infrastructure behind it was priceless, and that difference decided the air war before a single shot was fired.